Hello, this is for assignment 5.2a and b. So I will start first with 5.2a. According to Emerson and Smith, what is a racialized society? From my understanding, they're describing it as a society, they said on page 7, I believe, in the book, where race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, opportunities, and racial relationships. So um, I kind of understood it as a community or a society where race matters. It's not necessarily a melting pot where there's even playing field. It's basically where race plays a part in everyday life, whether for good or for bad. I think in most cases, it's not for the best. Um, on page 8, they say a major problem in understanding race relations in the US is that we tend to understand racism, and the form of racialization as constants rather than variables. And this has grave implications. So, um, a lot of times we place people in boxes or categories based on how they look, their race, their age, their gender. And it's my understanding that this is kind of the racialized society. I grew up in southern Indiana in Bedford, Lawrence County, then moved to Bloomington, then moved to Indianapolis in 2008. And when I go back to southern Indiana, I see this racialized society where race matters profoundly and it has damning effects on people of color in the sundown towns. Bedford, Lawrence County was actually one of those towns where blacks are excluded. So, um, and I even see, going on to the second point of color blindness being counterproductive. I see this in my own family. Sadly, in one side of my family, I have a very diverse family. On the other side of my family, I have a very conservative, um, not very understanding, basically this like colorblind, not necessarily saying like they see, I don't see color, that type of thing, but more so like just blind to some of the issues that go on, and not very open minded. So um, that is particularly counterproductive because there are a lot of issues that when you say that you're blind to anything, um, it can cause damage. So something that I kind of talked about in my post regarding color blindness is just the fact that when you fail to see color, you have the potential of damaging yourself and someone else. Something that from the book on page 89, it talks about specifically white evangelicals, but they wonder why they must be challenged with problems of race um, when they did not or do not cause it. And I think that is a huge issue when you don't want to be part of the solution, or you don't want to be challenged with something because you aren't necessarily the direct cause, or you don't necessarily have the solution for it, or you didn't contribute to the past. But as a body of Christ, we're the body. We have to work in tandem to recognize how do we help the other members of the body. And when I think it was Paul that talks about this in Corinthians, to the church at Corinth, I believe that um, he was specifically talking about spiritual gifts. But when we talk about the body, if we were to use the example of people of color and white people on different various limbs of our body, just because my fingers and my toes may look similar, but they're used for a different function, I need both of them. Someone who's white versus someone who's of color, let's say someone who's black, um, we all need each other, even though we look different with some differences besides our skin color. We need each other, and we can't be blind to the fact that even though I have 10 fingers and 10 toes. They're different. They are. I mean, they're different. They're on different parts of my body. Um, I have to recognize that my brothers and sisters who are African American, they look different than me. They're not the same as me. We all grew up in the same household, but we have different backgrounds equally. So, but we all need each other. We're all a family unit. So we can't just become color blind to this. And then on the third point, in your opinion, why does talking about race or ethnicity become difficult? People don't want to admit to their lack of knowledge, or people don't want to admit to their convictions. I think it goes back to that point in the book where I just said that, they didn't cause it and they didn't contribute to some of the issues that are going on, so they don't want to admit to it. And I think a lot of it, it's just, there's phases of a mourning process. So we go through denial, anger, these various phases. I think that goes for our conversations about race as well. And I've even noticed it in some of the conversations that are being had in the discussion post. It's interesting to see how some people don't think that this is a necessary conversation in a seminary class, or how this, doesn't necessarily talk about Jesus necessarily, but we don't have to, it doesn't necessarily address anything about Jesus necessarily, but Jesus didn't treat others the way that we've seen others treated in the United States. So I apologize, I'm kind of dancing around my words, but it just goes to show that there's a lack of knowledge, there's a lack of exposure, and we're all intelligent individuals, and people don't want to admit that lack of knowledge. That's my opinion, and it's difficult to address because they either don't see it or they're in denial about it, and they just don't want to address it. So moving on to 5.2b, traces of the trade video was interesting. It's always crazy how someone can, in the beginning, some of the individuals were talking about, like, I just don't think that I'll be able to relate, or I don't think that um, I'll have a connection. And then as the video went on, they really talked about different things that kind of moved them or touched them. And I thought the end was really powerful when the priest went up and touched all their heads, as she gave her sermon about the elders going in and doing their own ritual. I think the key here is, so what role did racialization play in the creation and maintenance in Bristol? So obviously, James DeWolf was a very wealthy merchant. He became wealthy off of the expense of Africans, which, it was saying that he was one of the wealthiest Americans in the United States, and he ran his business off of the maltreatment or mistreatment of Africans, and it's not okay. The slave trade, I mean, it said that he created banks, he created an insurance company, he was involved in the rum distribution, the Episcopal Church. I mean, there's so many things that he was praised for, but he became wealthy off of a very illegitimate business. To what extent do you believe the advantages and disadvantages are still in effect? I mean, I would imagine that there aren't very many black people in Bristol today. People of color are probably turned off from being there. I mean, they probably know the history, whereas the DeWolf family is, just finding out the details of this, and they're still reaping the benefits of their ancestors as far as wealth and distribution goes. So that's the advantages and disadvantages of how that's still affecting the economy there today. Um, some of the things that raised questions were one of the things that kind of rubbed me the wrong way was in the beginning when one of the gentlemen, they were sitting in the room speaking to one of the Africans when they first got there. And he said, I couldn't relate to any of the Africans, but I could relate to my ancestors sitting in that room doing the negotiating. And it's just like, if people would just realize, like, put yourself in someone else's shoes. I worked in a corporate office for a very long time in a male dominated industry where it was all about the bottom dollar, and no one really cared about the no one really valued the employee. The people at the top didn't value the employees. Women weren't promoted. It was all about how much money can we make. And I see that specifically in, this white male who's talking about I could only relate to my ancestor who would have been sitting there negotiating, but negotiating the trade of a human being who's about to be torn from life as they knew it. So it just continues to raise questions about how do people, it's a renewing of your mind. It's all about how have you been raised? What have you been exposed to? I really enjoyed the video, the difference between us, the race to power of illusion. The question is, to what extent do you believe the illusion of race contributes to the creation of conception? Yeah, I mean, I think for a very long time, um, people always tie, athletes with African Americans, or even one gentleman who worked for the university as a professor. He said people come up to him and ask him if he's the football coach or basketball coach, something like that. And it's just interesting. I really liked how the classroom, they chose, who do they think that they're most like, and the Hispanic kids said that I'm going to be more like the girl who's Hispanic, or the African American kids said I'm going to be more like them. But when it comes down to biology, race is not biological. Someone in the video said that there must be a paradigm shift. And I would agree with that. I think that a lot of times, even in this video, it says biology becomes an excuse. And when they were interviewing some of the white young men in the race, the track race, the track meet, they were saying like, oh, the black kids beat us because of their makeup, their biological makeup, which again is an excuse. And I think that there's power in that. Our mind, like that has a psychological effect on us as well. And I think that's very evident in, that track meet. I think that it goes back to this nature versus nurture. Growing up having an African American father, I feel like um, even though I'm white and I do have a Caucasian father who I have a relationship with and who raised me for a portion of my life, for a majority of my life, my dominant father was African American, and I was raised in that culture, in that household. I go to a predominantly African American church, and I feel like that I relate to that culture in a way that maybe other Caucasian people don't. But it goes back to how I was raised, the upbringing that I was in. Um, so yeah, I think that it's a psychological effect. It has a psychological effect. For my family members who have not been around any culture except their own, who grew up in a small town, those sundown towns, that's all they know, that's all they've been exposed to. And, I would like to say that it's a generational shift, but even my cousins who, you know, grew up in that same town, I listen to them talking, and it's disheartening to see that they, even as our generation continues to be more liberal, I think. There are just some people who don't even want to be exposed to other cultures. They don't have a desire to learn more. And I think it really goes back to that passage of it's renewing our mind. It's not just renewing our mind to know Christ better, it's renewing our mind to know how can we put on the lens that Jesus saw people. Jesus was brown. Like he grew up in the Middle East. There's no way that he had my complexion. There's just no way. I mean, geographically, it doesn't even make sense for him to look like me. Um, I believe that Jesus probably did have brown skin of some type. I think a lot of people are in denial about that. They don't want to believe that Jesus was anything but white, and it's not even possible, considering the geographic location that he was born into. So, even though we don't know. I guess we'll never know until the day of glory. But um, it's renewing our mind to put on the lens of Christ. How did Christ view people? We know that he wasn't blind. He wasn't colorblind. He wasn't economically blind to differences because he welcomed those other people. He welcomed others. Therefore, he saw it and he recognized it. So I'm appreciating this class. I'm enjoying the content. I pray that it will open the eyes for other people and even open our eyes beyond just black and white. I think that cultural context goes beyond just black and white, even though that's kind of the dominant issues that we see in our day to day. I pray that we can even go beyond that and even some of the issues that are going on in the Middle East and trickling over the Muslim culture and even at the border in Mexico. So just continuing to pray that this will open our eyes and that we will continue to learn together as a class and teach each other. And thank you for everything that you're doing for our class and the healthy discussion in our posts. Thank you.